It's time to talk stewardship again.
And so after you've gone through all the process of discussing with the various groups, what are the next steps once you have all of the ideas?
You will have invited a team of people to work together on this whole project. And they're a working team, they're not a committee making decisions, they're a working team that will sift through all the maybe mountains of ideas, because you're not limiting people, you're not saying you're only allowed one thing. They sift through them to work through and discover common threads that they can see emerging from all of them. And eventually you emerge with, I don't know, maybe a dozen things, and you may feel you've got to go then back to those little groups, same groups, and say to them, we're obviously not going to do all of them. If you believe God is calling us to do one of these things, what would it be? And you very often narrow it down to 2, 3, maybe only one thing that is a common ground for almost the entire people of God in that place.
And in your experience, that those 1 or 2 themes actually do emerge? It's not a case of everybody has a different idea, you really do see that?
I found it's uncanny almost, the way in which a few common threads seem to emerge from all the welter of information and ideas and suggestions that have come up. And it emerges that there are a few things. Now, I'm convinced that when you have the old-fashioned visioning group, we get a mountain of stuff, and you say, well, this is our vision. It's so overwhelming that 9 times out of 10, nobody does anything. And there's a sense of why bother. In fact, you get people saying, well, not another visioning committee. I did this in an entire diocese and discovered that several things, not many, but several things emerged from the whole diocese of what the whole diocese was telling me God was calling us to do. And they weren't my ideas. In fact, they didn't seem to think much of my ideas, but they emerged. And that changed the face of the diocese.
And you talk about working in 1 or 2 year time frames. Is this helpful to have for people to see sort of a 1 or 2 concrete ideas that can be done in a reasonable time frame? Does that help people kind of realize that it can be done?
I think that the old style of doing long-range planning, say for the next 25 years, we dream about what's going to happen. Nowadays, you don't think in terms of 25 years. Planners think in terms of 5 years, more likely. It doesn't mean that you say at the end of 2 years, we stop doing this thing that God is calling us to do, but to say that's our kind of time frame when we assess how we're doing and whether we've completed it. You may say, it's really done what we set out to do. Let's give thanks for it, move on and look for something else.
And you often talk about the idea that we're called to be faithful, that we're not necessarily called to be successful in everything we do, but we have to try and we have to be faithful. So is that something that congregations, it's good for them to remember as they go through this process, that they shouldn't be afraid to risk everything, because if it doesn't work out, what is lost? Nothing.
There's a great fear in most people to fail. Scripture doesn't make that point. I mean, in Jesus' parable that I almost recite by heart in almost every congregation, the parable of the talents, where the one person who was criticized in that was the one person who did nothing. That he just didn't try and do anything, so of course he failed. The others were faithful. And I love the story of the 4th man, and I've told you this before about the 4th man who did well and worked hard and was faithful, and then lost everything in a storm. And he's commended because he was faithful, not because he was a success. Now I think we have to say to people, we're allowed to fail. If we weren't allowed to fail, none of us could survive in God's presence.
And when people have been part of the building the vision, do you find that their response because obviously once you have a vision and a direction you're going, it takes people's time, it takes their energies, it takes their not their God's financial resources, not their financial resources. But do you find that there's more engagement at that level once they've been part of the vision?
That's a point where some people are a little nervous. Some people are very nervous of saying, I will do this, or I will give this. I think we again have to say to people, you're only declaring what you believe God is calling you to do, and you're trying to respond. Again, back to what we were saying, you can fail. Maybe you won't live up to that. That's why I've dropped the word pledge. Pledge, a lot of people felt that a pledge was a kind of a binding contract. I mean, I've even met people who've actually left the church because having made a financial pledge and they couldn't keep up to it, they left the church. Well, now I would say that's a tragedy. Absolutely. That a person should be able to say, I failed. God understands I failed. I've been doing it in every other sphere of my life. Why shouldn't I do it here? I often fail, but I'm determined to be faithful.
So you use the term declaring intentions rather than pledge. Do you find that people respond to that better? Well,
I find the word pledge is loaded for many people. I still think of making a pledge, but I understand a lot of people are nervous about the word pledge. And so I've come to use the word, and a lot of people are using the word now to say, this is my intention. In the light of what God is calling us to do, this is my intention to respond in this way. And people are a little more relaxed about that. They feel they can say, yeah, I intend to do this. I don't know whether I will. I intend to give this much time in the life of the church and God's work outside the church. And I think that's what honors the call of God to do what God wants us to do.
And how you talked about the importance of communicating with parishioners throughout the process, communicating back where you are in the process. So once you actually have the vision, you have people declaring their intentions, how do you keep people engaged in the ministry as it's playing out?
I used to listen to, quite often in congregations, what people called a stewardship moment, when individuals said, this is how I am a steward. I found that many congregations just turn off at that point. Whereas if you talk to them about the process that they have been involved in and what they have been doing and how their process is going and what they are achieving in that process and where God is leading all of us, there's much more engagement.
And is it the same team that started the process, the visioning process, or are they the people that get up and make those kind of updates?
I would suspect that they would be the ones to start that. It should never just be the rector. It should not be the finance chair or treasurer, because that implies that the real significance is the money. I think it has to be a variety of people.
Does it help if maybe some of the people that were involved in the visioning process outside of parish council come up?
That would be a very good way to do it, but I think the important thing is that they recognize they're saying, this is what the faith community has done, rather than this is what we, the committee, have done for you.
Can you think of even small examples of groups that have gone through this process and they've really found their common vision?
One comes to mind, I think, mostly because it was unexpected. It wasn't the way I expected this process to work out. This was a diocesan program of talking about how to approach stewardship from a different perspective. We were saying, essentially, right across the diocese, let's talk about what God is calling us to do. A parish worked on this and ended up with one thing that they believed God was calling them to do. It was in an area where there was a penitentiary. And this faith community, this congregation, believed God was calling us in some way, they didn't quite know how, but in some way to minister to that situation of emerging prisoners and families receiving them. And they looked at this and began to ask questions about how they could do it, and they came to two conclusions. First of all, there was no way they could do it alone, and they believed God was calling them to do. They contacted two other Anglican parishes nearby to discover that the same idea, the same sense had emerged in various ways in the other two congregations. And as they worked on it, they came to another conclusion. They said, we can do a lot of this, but we're still far short in the cost. So they came to the diocese, and they said, we want the diocese to be involved in this too, financially. We want a partnership with the diocese, because we believe that's what God is calling us to do. No, I found that tremendously exciting, that the diocese and three congregations within the diocese believed God was calling in this direction. And they worked on that. They worked on that for three years. Now that's the sort of thing that suddenly emerges. It wasn't a religious thing. I don't know whether it brought anybody into a church service more than they would have done otherwise. It didn't change the face of the Anglican Church, except that many people in that area saw the Anglican Church in a new light. Here it was, not looking after itself, not propping up its own institution, but actually reaching out to a need in a community.
It's a new way of life for congregation. It's not just I think you say we're not called to do stewardship programs, we're called to be stewards.
It's a life-changing process that will change your whole attitude to everything you do. And in the end, you'll find finances are taken care of. You can't put your needs on one side and say, we won't pay our rector anymore, we're going to do what God's calling us to do, we won't pay the light bill anymore. No, you carry on doing all these things. But you recognize that underlying it all is we're only doing these things because God is calling us. Everything we have belongs to God, and everything we do is an acknowledgement of that fact, including the way we spend our time, the way we use our skills, what we do with our financial resources. It's all part of the same deal. And the life of the church revolves around responding to what God is calling us to do. What first steps would you take to introduce this view of stewardship in your congregation? What holds back a congregation from looking at stewardship differently?